you for being here. It is an honor, and I have already enjoyed, and I mean, it's been a gift already, just the conversations I've already had with you, and I look forward to continuing them. I'm going to jump right in. I'll give one caveat, and then as I need to tell you more about myself, I'll say those things as we go through. The one thing I'll say, and if I can remember the quote from Anne Lamott, it's, I try not to go into my head alone, whatever that quote is. And so you're going to get a snapshot of that right away. And I'll ask you to trust me and stay with me. One of the things I do really well that sometimes doesn't make sense at first is I make connections between things that sometimes aren't always obvious. And so sometimes when I'm starting a presentation, it may seem like I'm pulling connections from different places, but stick with me because I have a way I'm going to be bringing it together. So I'm saying that to say, please play along. And also,
we're a cooperative crowd. You don't need to.
Yes, this is a great crowd. I could see. I could feel. I looked up the website. I could see it in your pictures. This is a place where people are happy, and that's a place where you learn great things and you make great contributions. So, it really is. I'm excited to be here. My Twitter handle at @notyetdone. I am really loving Twitter. I've been doing a lot more on it. So please love the conversation. And I say coming soon because everybody's doing it. I'm making a website. It's got almost nothing on it. So in 2 weeks, it's going to have something. I shared with Allison that I'll be entering into my penultimate year next year, and so I'm in that space where I'm going back and forth with a lot of different things. So that is the basic abstract I promised. We'll start with what I'm calling reverse Q&A. I'd like to ask you a few things before we get started, very briefly. And then what I want to do is spend a little time theorizing learning. And then I'll take you through some ways I've thought about that idea. Theorizing and analyzing learning as a teacher collective, as a teacher individual, and then what that helps me think about in my future work about just this big idea of analyzing teacher learning overall. That's the point that I'll want to make. And obviously some Q&A. But here's the goal. I want to convince you that frame analysis and communities of practice, these two typically disparate literatures, that when you blend them together in strategic ways, it's productive for a lot of reasons. But two main ones, it helps you theorize studies of teacher learning. It's a productive way to just conceptualize the whole work. And also it offers an empirical strategy for doing the work of the analysis work. And I'll show some examples of that, but that's what I'm hoping to convince you of by the time we leave today. So here's my icebreaker for you. I went to see 2 musicals. Those are the 2 fun things I've done in 8 years. I went to see 2 musicals over the summer. I went to see The King and I. So there's some getting to know you. And so I had to put that. And it was interesting to me because I'd not seen it before. It was because she was a teacher. I didn't know she was actually singing that song to her students because she wanted to get to know them. I didn't know it. So here's what I want you to think about, and I really, really, really want to hear from the crowd. So think about it on your own, or talk to someone. What is learning, and how do you know it when you see it? I know that's a big, giant question. I know it's not an easy one, but I really do care about it. What is learning, and how do you know it when you see it? What evidence convinces you that learning has happened? You personally. And one will likely leave open for now. But in what ways are these contributions generative for the field? So if you were to work with data and you have made a declaration that learning has happened according to the way you view learning, how was that the result of that work? How was that generative? So take just a moment on your own, think of some ideas. I watched the time. I heard the comment of we're in a group of learning sciences, and it's like I think even when we're in a group of learning sciences, I think it's a really hard question. It's still hard for me to think about, even though I like to think about it a lot. I'll say more about that in a moment.
We'll get back to this.
One idea. Who's willing to share one idea that you talked about?
Well, we talked about that it's a mental and physical thing. So it's not just what you see, but there are things and processes that are happening in your brain and in your thoughts that are, maybe starting learning.
And so what would count as evidence?
the ability to articulate the ideas and maybe set them in different use them in different settings.
Thank you. Thank you for going first. I appreciate that. Another volunteer. Some more ideas.
We just talked about it. I always think of learning as change of some sort. Change in knowledge, skill, disposition. And I know what you're going to ask. Evidence.
I have Lonnie Horn as an advisor. This was every comment. I can't help it at this point.
So knowledge could be in just things you say. Things you say, things you do, and
Things you feel. Well, I mean, I think one thing that we brought up also is that it's, there's socially and culturally legitimated ways of observing those changes.
Okay, so say more.
So for example, standardized test is a particular way of measuring changes, the move towards growth curves and things like that. But it's the reason why they're so powerful is because they've been socially and culturally legitimated over time. Even though within this room many people might not believe that a standardized test is the greatest or even a good measure of learning.
Well, and but that wasn't the question. That wasn't what, it's like, how do you see it? And so it may not even be a favorite, but it is a way.
Sure.
It measures something.
But it may not convince you.
Oh, it doesn't convince
But
me.
it may not convince you. So that's their piece of it. It convinces some people. Thank you.
I think one way somebody learns is, learning and teaching are deeply intertwined. So if you can teach someone else what you have learned, then that's how, A, I know you learned it, and B, how you know that you learned it yourself.
So it sounded like the same thing a little bit. So I guess what I would want to say here, I should correct my own scribing here. So the evidence is that when you're teaching it to somebody else, that's providing the evidence that you've done it. And then what is the learning?
I guess I don't want to say consumption, but I guess the looking at the materials, working through the content, all that stuff. Yeah.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is it something about sense making? I mean, I don't mean to.
Yeah, it's using all your multimodalities.
It's fancy.
Oh, it's just.
At least for me, it was easier to start with the evidence or what this looks
Sure.
like. And so when I think about teaching my own students, I look at how they articulate their existing knowledge, but then how do they start to integrate new knowledge, and the fact of when they talk about both of them together and they're trying to make connections and try to articulate new ideas from adding new conceptual information. That to me is a sense that they are working toward that learning or exploring when they're trying to blend things together.
See if I'm getting this. It sounds like what you're saying is it's like there's some kind of change or shift or something, and you will have the best word for it, but it's a becoming. It's like okay, I know this thing, but it's a depth of understanding is stronger. I'm not sure I'm capturing what you're saying.
Yeah, because when they can integrate new information into what they already know and express then new idea or new understanding. I mean, we use grapple so much, but I really do love that word.
Grapple. And I'll begin to wrap this up and make the point that I'm going to. But let me just say though, for the good of the order, any other ideas that need to get out, because I am in a room of learning scientists. Any other ideas that need to be on this board for the good of the order?
Well, Don and I got into the Don and Josh thing. Whether meaning needs to be in there or not, Don has a beautiful operational definition of learning. I'm not going to try to repeat it. Could you do yours, Don?
What did I say to Josh this time? A changing meaning that can be observed in an interpretative context.
Say it one more time.
A change in meaning that can be observed in an interpretative context.
And so he also said of that individual, but we don't have to put that in there. But like the thing that I picked up on in there was whether meaning needs to be in there or not. And we were starting down a road that we need to get back to sometime about not reducing learning to behaviors, but that I'm very interested in just sort of changing regularities of participation in a context. And that those regularities can be very behavioral and be learning for me. And so that's kind of where we were at, is this issue between meaning and behaviors or regularities of participation or something like that. So we're hoping you're going to fix this all out, straighten it out for us, Nicole.
I'll ask a lot of questions.
So if you
Good
called
at
it
that.
regularities of participation,
You would have been
agree
with me.
I agree with you.
I had time to work on it.
Other ideas? I saw another hand.
Yeah, we went the change direction as well, and then got to like, well, but not all change is learning, right? And so that, and I think it goes to Josh's idea of regularities, that there's something that's valued, that is relative to something that's valued in a given social context. Because change can, if change moves against that which is valued, it might not be considered learning relative to that community, for example. That makes sense.
Thank you for that beautiful segue. That's perfect. Thank you for making that point. So that actually brings me to the way I was going to transition into how I think about this. When I was in, let's see, I believe I was in Lonnie's classroom discourse course, and I was reading Communities of Practice. And for me, this issue came up because we were looking at Wenger's definition of learning being a change in participation in a community of practice over time, or this idea of growing into becoming a new timer, old timer, the other way it's described too. I usually say the change in participation. And that exact issue came up for me because I'm reading Communities of Practice and we're reading about the Xerox studies or the studies, and I'm thinking, how is this productive? Because I think I'm pretty good at arguing this. I think I could argue that almost anything is a change in participation in a community of practice. And so for me, it landed on this idea of what's productive, and that's something we'll take up as we keep going on in the presentation. So thank you for making those points. It's something we think about a lot. Another thing I'll add too, especially for any grad students who are going through your comps or preparing for your comps, my comps experience, it was important. And my advisor said, okay, I want to see an annotated bibliography of everything you ever read since you've been in grad school. Let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want you to organize it into 3 groups somehow. Figure that out. She said, that'll help me understand where your thinking is and where your problem space is. And from that, she crafted questions that were going to press me somewhere that I needed to go. And so the first question was about teacher learning. It was identifying problems within the teacher community and teacher learning literature. And what I realized by reading a lot of different papers, scholars I cite heavily, scholars I trust, scholars who are amazing at this work, I did not have a clear sense by reading their work of what learning is. They made claims about learning, but I didn't have a strong sense of what is it. And these studies, and I'm not saying that their studies aren't correct or that I don't trust the results. That's not the argument I'm making. I was just being super greedy at the time, thinking I'm trying to figure out what learning is. As I shared with the grad students, I was fortunate enough to work with Elham Kazmi, and when I was a new grad student and panicking a little bit, she said, "Nicole, you're learning to join an in-progress conversation of expertise that's already been going on, and you have a lot to say to it. You have a lot to contribute, but you need to do some work to understand what's already been done and what people are already thinking about." So I thought I was doing my due diligence of what's already been done. What do all these scholars I know and love, what do they have to say about learning? And I think they get it. I just couldn't understand what it was based on their papers. And so the short of it is, so I had to go create my own way. I had to go figure out a way to do the heavy lifting for the work that I did. There we go. So this icebreaker, we worked on this math task. If you came in a few minutes late, we're going to just continue moving forward. What this was is, it's a math task that I made up. It's about these things that I call glass figurines. And it asks some questions about, these are glass figurines, they're delicate, they need to be stored in cases. Which figure needs the smallest box? Which figure wastes the least amount of space? How do you know? This might be the kind of problem that would be a good one for school, for kids to work in school, or teachers in professional development. I use good and heavy quotes because that's an open question. I'm not making the claim that this is a big problem or that it should be done. Just as a point of focus for our group of, let's just pretend that we are thinking about this problem, that there's a group of students who work this problem. So, in interest of time, I made up a hypothetical classroom scenario that is representative of a large data set. It is hypothetical, but it accurately represents the data and what's there, and it will get us into the conversation more quickly. So here's the story. I'll read it to you. A 5th grade teacher observes from across the room that a student group is struggling to figure out the volume of the icebreaker figures. Groups were advised to build the figures using centimeter cubes to help them think about the problem. But this group thinks that centimeter cubes are too babyish and attempt to solve the problem in their heads. A student named Taylor arrives to the class late and joins the in-progress work of the group. After several minutes pass with no progress, Taylor retrieves centimeter cubes from the resource cabinet and attempts to build the figures. One student mumbles that centimeter cubes are for babies, as Taylor returns to a seat. Taylor begins using the centimeter cubes to model the problem, although a few of the cubes are in the wrong place. His group decides to help Taylor, and so they lean in and start moving around some of the blocks. Before they can begin the counting work, Taylor knocks over the blocks and has a big laugh. This happens several times before the teacher can get over to this group. The group gets really annoyed with Taylor for halting their progress. On your own. You're the teacher in that classroom. What are possible ways in which the teacher might interpret Taylor's interactions in this scenario? You're the teacher. How do you interpret what's going on? Think about that. Briefly, we'll turn and talk. The person who spoke first last time speaks second this time. Just share one idea with your elbow partner. Let's come back together. Very briefly. Just a few ideas. In this middle column, by the way, this is a protocol that was developed by a colleague of mine at Clemson. And he uses this with his pre-service teachers as an observation tool. And the purpose of it is to help teachers develop multiple explanations for why things may be going on in classrooms. And so
I'm sorry, for what?
For multiple explanations for why things may be happening in classrooms rather than just the first reaction that could be different things. So for example, with Taylor, again, just a few quick ideas on this. How do we account for this? How might you interpret this as a teacher? What might be going on with this? Ideas? What's up?
It seems like there's some conflicting social dynamics going on between Taylor and the rest of his group.
So could be some social problems in the group, sure.
I like the knowledge because he was late, so maybe he got frustrated.
Plausible. What else?
Well, you always get that one student who figures it out really quickly. And I'm thinking maybe Taylor was able to take those cubes, figure it out, and then when the others decided to join him, just pushed him over and had a good laugh because they wouldn't do it. Start.
Thank you.
Taylor's a troublemaker, and he's always doing this.
Yeah, I had him last year. That's
You see how this goes. I mean, so thank you for playing along on that one. I appreciate that. That brings me to some excerpts from the data, and these are some of these are reprinted in the paper. So first scenario, I have this kid who is really flaky and doesn't know what's going on, and is really starting to annoy the rest of the group. So that's a really struggling kid, and so they're starting to opt out. Same kid. He's not doing well now, but Taylor is so smart. And so here I am at the end of the year, and I'm thinking, why would I put him back in Math 1? Because he obviously understands stuff. So I think there are some kids we need to look at a little differently. There are some kids maybe we shouldn't really keep back, because then we're really sentencing them to not ever be able to come out of that. Really different ways of looking at the same situation. This is actually the same teacher, same kid, different time points. And that's important methodologically. Because in some studies, you may be interested in multiple teacher perspectives on the same situation. Like this could be teacher A and teacher B watching a video of the same kid. But in fact, for this data, this is episodic, meaning that it is the same teacher talking about the same kid at different time points in the year. So those kinds of decisions matter in your studies and what you want to show and how you want to show it. So the way that I worked with this, because I'll tell you, I'll tell the Eureka moment. I knew that learning had happened in the group that I'll tell you about. I knew it. But it was so linear in the way, like all the tools I kept using to show learning felt dishonest because it was too clean, and it was too pretty. And I know that learning is messy, and I know it's back and forth. And you might, you don't learn something and all of a sudden, you might go back on that the next day. It's a messy space. And so I needed theoretical tools that would preserve it, but also let me tell a story of learning. And so that's what I couldn't figure out. The Eureka moments I had, I was on a plane from, I think, Seattle to Reagan. I was reading Cynthia Coburn's paper about reading policy instruction. And it hit me like a lead balloon, as my dad would say. I was like, that's it. That's it. I also happened to be at the same time taking a class in social movement theory from Walter Parker. So it was a convergence of spaces that put me in the right place at the right time to start making some of these connections. And said, the way that Cynthia Coburn is connecting sense-making, I wonder if this could be, if this idea of frame analysis, if I could use this to document change in participation. I wonder if I can do that. And so that's what started the process. That's how it happened. And then I was excited because I had my original idea as a grad student. I was in perpetual fear that I wouldn't have the original idea, but the thing that you learn is, oh wait, I have too many original ideas. I have too much data. That wasn't the problem at all. It was how do I have time to write it all up, as it turns out. So what I did, one way, for example, to say this, and again, you may not completely agree with the slogans I've attached. Some of this is because I've spent a lot of time with a lot of data. But even so, you may not agree with this entirely. That's okay. But if I were to characterize this, it's like, okay, this teacher's calling this the flaky, annoying kid who tends to opt out. And in the year, it's like, well, you know what, this kid's smart, but he's not yet getting passing grades. It's a different way to frame that situation. So here's why I care. Because this right here, what comes next? If this is what you think, what do you do next? If this is what you think, what do you do next? That's what matters. That's what matters, how you frame things. That's why frame analysis was so powerful for me, because it carried that with it. It carried the work of agency along with the ride. And gave me some hints, more so than say just a straight up change in discourse. That's what it didn't do. That's what I wasn't getting in the other work. So briefly, and I have a cleaner version in the paper, but this is what I came up with. And for me, when I get stuck in writing and I'm not sure where I am, I really have to close the computer and I have to stand up and I have to draw and put pictures and Post-its and everything's decorated with ideas. And so this came out of a lot of drawing and thinking and putting ideas together. I started with this idea of learning in a community of practice, this shift from a peripheral to central participation in an activity, where learning is described as changes of participation within a community of practice. And Wenger describes these dual, my apologies for the blue, this duality of processes of participation and reification. They're like, the best way I can say this is like goober grape. It's that peanut butter and jelly that's in the same jar at the grocery store. You can't separate it. Much as you'd like to, you can't. And so to me, that was the way I was thinking about this. It's like, so it's really hard to tell if you're just eating grape jelly or if you're eating the peanut butter. You don't really, it's kind of a little bit of both. It's one way to think about it. So the way it was most helpful for me to figure it out, it's like, okay, this is the experiential process of taking part in something. And the idea that resonated the most with me was the reification is the giving form to experience through objects that can congeal this experience into thingness. Whether it's a slogan or a thing, it's making it tangible in some way. And what I'll argue is that frame analysis gives us a tool for thinking about this. So some of these details are in the paper, so I'll speed through some of these, and if I need to come back, I will, because these are just some of the necessary parts of the study. Like, who were the people that I was working with? We were working with a group of teachers at a high school. They were part of a math science partnership. We called them Septima Clark High School. They were doing professional development. They had experienced a failure crisis in their 9th grade where 75% of the students were failing. And we had built strong relationships with them, and they said, help us, because this is not okay. These are great teachers. These are teachers you would want for your own children. These are not bad teachers. So they're doing their best, and this is still happening, and they're like, what are we going to do? And so because these are activist type teachers, they're like, we're throwing everything out. We're getting a new curriculum, and we're like, we tried to actually put on the brakes a little bit because we wanted to support them, and we know how hard this is. And we also, this is where I worked with the teachers. We were trained in complex instruction, and we were also did work with IMP. We didn't choose IMP. It was a strategic move that teachers wanted. For us, we thought that the pedagogy was the more important decision than the curriculum. Curriculum matters. That's not the point. We knew that could be accomplished in a variety of ways. They wanted everything, and we said, I can't say, I say Lonnie. She said, we have got to find a way to support this, because we know their commitment, they're going to do this with or without us, and this is a huge task. And so she wrote some money in order to provide them with an extra planning period in the day, so that they would have a common planning time in addition to their regular planning time, so that they would have time to collaborate and do this work. I followed that group. So they have given the schedule, you have A days, B days, so some days are longer than others. I was always present for the day that was super long, and I audio recorded all of those. I visited their classrooms, interviews, all of those types of data. But the data that was the primary data for the study would be the meeting data. And in terms of what counts, well, you had to have a certain number of people there. You had to, let me get this next. Let me get this next part of it. So first of all, if I'm saying that learning, if I'm using communities of practice to theorize learning and the group of people in the study, then I need to make sure that I can articulate that the group in the study meets the criteria. So this is, the grad students we were talking earlier about this, this is where I'm talking about seeing your theoretical framework in the rest of your paper. So it's, okay, were they mutually engaged in activity? Did they have a joint enterprise? Were there shared repertoire, norms, customs, and practices? So first verifying that that's actually what was going on with them. And then, as a next layer in terms of data reduction, I thought, what's organizing this group? This is going back to what's productive and what's value. I said, well, what's organizing this group in the first place? Well, they came together because of a student struggle crisis. So I should really focus on conversations or meetings where that's the topic that's being discussed. Because that was something that they created. I'll also say while I'm here, when you're doing frame analysis work, my opinion doesn't matter. It's almost like you're doing ethnographic work. Your job is to understand how the other person frames the situation. So some researchers and scholars have, I'm not the first person to ever use framing. That's an idea that's used a lot and very productively. But sometimes researchers are using it to say they are imposing a framing on a situation. And that's fine. I support academic freedom and leveraging different frameworks for the way you need them. For me and the way I'm thinking about data, it was very important that I was representing, and as best as I could as a researcher, how would I characterize the way the teacher is doing the framing? Like when I had to side with the flaky, annoying kid versus the other way. It doesn't matter if I think it's okay to say a kid's flaky and annoying. It's how is that person saying it?
Were you
Please.
participating in the conversations?
Yes and no. So that's a really great question because I think about, like Wayne and I think about communities of practice and like say the nexus of multi-membership. I think about boundaries, brokers, all of those different, so those are ideas I really had to wrestle with. And so we were part of the community. With that said, we were not teachers in the building. And so we were not part of that. So this group actually, they were learning complex instruction, which is a kind of group work pedagogy, to put it to essentialize it. There are certain norms and structures and routines, and they impose them on their own group. So they almost had their own governance. They even said, okay, this week I'm going to be team captain. This week I'm going to be resource monitor. I'm going to bring the snacks. And so we sort of set up boundaries within the group. And so it's not that we were trying to be a fly on the wall, because we all have backgrounds in ethnography, and so we strongly align with participant observation. But we didn't feel like it was about us. And we know that the people doing the talking are the people doing the most learning. And so we needed to really take a backseat to what was going on. And if we were like a teacher in the room, if you're called upon and they need you, we'll help. Or if we have an idea that we think needs to be said, we might interrupt. But for the most part, we would just hang back and let it happen as organically as possible. Certainly, if we felt there was something we need to say, we would wait until the absolute last minute to really privilege what was going on in the room. Because we knew that when we introduced, it's like a teacher joining a group. You're changing a power dynamic. And so when that happened, we were very mindful of it. And selfishly too, those are usually not the cases where you're going to have usable data. Because if it's about you, then there are certainly usable pieces where we are in the conversation, but if it were one of us leading it, that's no longer about the group, the salient group. Please.
Related question. What about like the structures? And maybe you'll get to this, but was that facilitated in any way, or were there sort of artifacts or structures that were sort of presented to this group, or did they generate their own?
That is a great question, and so I will give the caveat of I'm not suggesting that this is a drag and drop model. this was at a unique contextual place and time, and it was situated. And so there are lessons we take away from this. But as one of the problems was, say, the teacher community literature is with Grossman said it a long time ago, it's like community's lost its meaning. You know, my husband's been a teacher for 17 years. He says we have PLC time. You know, and so that is nowhere close to the work that we do in this room about the kind of communities that have the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for. So, with that said, with this group, we had already started complex instruction training, so they had been exposed to really high quality PD where they were learning participation structures. We're careful to say these are participation structures, not intellectual structures. And the group, it's almost like they had like they didn't take vows, but it's like they treated it like a sacred space, and they said amongst themselves, "This is as if we're teaching in class. We're not late to class when we teach. We don't leave early when we teach. We're here and we're fully present." And so that was something that the group established. There were 5 of them, so it was also very small. It was also special because we had had relationships with them for 3 years. They trusted us. We knew them as people. And they knew that Lonnie went and wrote money, and the other part of the story is if you change the principal, so there are all these working parts. That's the next paper we still have to write. The principal was willing to reorganize the master schedule. It's a big deal. Now there were classes not covered, so we had to have another teacher in the building. And so who's going to come in? And so, because Lonnie was a methods instructor, you know, we could recommend some of our pre-service teachers who were going into teaching who might be a good fit. You know, they didn't just do what we said. They had to apply for the job and get it. So we were able to supply another teacher in a school that's sometimes hard to staff, a high-quality teacher. So that's how some of that work started, and I would say that with this group too, it came with a lot of support. We want that to be part of the story. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just, although some of the pieces were organic, it was very well supported, and a lot of people put in a lot of hours to make it happen. Administrative, university, and teachers. And then they set up their own norms for, okay, I'm the facilitator, so I'm going to take notes for the group. I'm the team captain, so I'm going to make sure that I'm checking in to see if everybody's contributing, those kinds of things. Thank you for that. So what happened at this point? This was a sticky point with, and this is when I wrote this paper it was for my dissertation work, and I wrote up the paper for the Journal of Learning Sciences. And it was a really hard paper to write, I'll just say. And this was a point that I had to come back and I explained it a certain way, and this was a point I had to keep coming back to and figuring out a better way to say it. So this is what came after several years of work on it. And so, I didn't make these ideas. It's the connections that took me quite some time. So again, framing is the interactive, productive process of shaping and structuring existing meanings. And what was helpful is frames ultimately do the work of assigning blame, posing solutions, and motivating action. So, as I mentioned, we did a data reduction related to struggling students. And then what I did in terms of data coding is I went through all of the reduced data set, and I looked for places where I spotted a frame where this was going on, where they were diagnosing something or blaming. And then I also looked for where are they proposing a solution, or where is there an implied solution. If you go back to the frame analysis literature, there's also motivational framing, and I did code for that. It was just so much that there comes a point where you have to just cut it off and say this is enough, and I'll keep working on this. It was enough for where it was. With Josh sitting in the room, I think the first paper I submitted was like 75 pages long. I struggled because the paper was 2 papers in one, and I couldn't figure out how to separate it because it was the theory and it was the finding. I didn't know how to tease those apart. Eventually I figured it out, because of some very strong mentoring that really shaped me as a professional, quite frankly, from the journal, and I'm appreciative for it. It was a lot of work, and it was very well worth it. A little side note to those new at publishing: don't return your revisions unless they're ready. They probably need more work than you think, and if it is, I will say this, and I mean this: getting 12 pages of feedback is a gift. That is investment in somebody's work. And I just had a baby, I mean, that's why I was. And so I turned my revisions back around for the paper. They weren't adequate. They weren't even close. And so they were just like, huh? And so very thankfully they saw through that, and they were also very gracious and understanding. They were probably working with somebody who was a little new and green around their edges. So, but eventually I figured it out, and it all worked out in the end. And I'm really proud of the work that came out of it. Very proud. So one of the ways that like I said, when I map things out, it helps me make connections and see things. This is one of the things I did. I'm looking for changes in participation. So again, this is where I'm letting my theoretical framework do the heavy lifting. This is where it keeps coming back and keeps coming back and keeps coming back. So if you step back, it's like, oh, I can see change in participation. I'm looking for that somehow. And then also, how am I also working in frame analysis? How is this working? So this was just a chart I put together to see if there was anything there. And that's how I was able to document the shifts. This is where the empirical finding came from. And what I liked about this is with the place where I could say, oh, that thing I wanted before, where I wanted to preserve the messy parts of learning, but also document a productive shift, this is what let me do it. And that's why it was so powerful for me, because it let it be what it was without, because like, for example, at the beginning, like the kids who fail are those who don't do their homework. Well, you know what? I'm a teacher. If you don't do your homework, it is important. So I don't mean to characterize that as universally bad or good. It's what else is part of the conversation and what do you do next? And so again, the reason this was so powerful for me is it made space for that. You could have all of those things in the same conversation, but really begin to tease apart of what was really there, the overarching framing.
Could I just
Please.
jump in on that point
Please do.
real briefly? Love what you just said.
Please do.
And the not judging the framing, not deciding to evaluate a person based on the framing, because that same diagnostic framing, the kids who don't do their homework, they're not really trying. They're not really trying. Two people can have different prognostic framings on that.
That's
One
right.
person can say, the kid's not doing his homework, he's not trying in this class, and I'm not giving up on him until he tries. Right? That's a very different prognostic. I'm sorry.
No, it
you
is.
You
No,
just
please.
inspired me, so go ahead.
No,
I'm sorry.
no, please do. Because I'm
Very
getting
deep.
tired, and I would love I would love for someone else to take over. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
But that's it, though. And I appreciate you saying that, because I actually learn a lot when I hear other people say it. That helps me a lot. This was the part that was so important. It's like, because we care about what comes next. It's like this framing is the onus for achievement is primarily on the students, and that's where the conversation ends. But here, there's a means for action. It's the yet. So if you ever go in a classroom I've been in, I usually have in the corner the yet poster that no one can reach. So we can all, and so that, and my students learn very quickly that if you say, well, if it's a conversation ender, then when they're in a classroom without the yet, everybody's just pointing in the corner saying, so it's the yet idea. If you like Sesame Street, I think Nora Jones has a Sesame Street video of the power of yet. It is really powerful for us too. And so for me, going back to sort of my overall research agenda and where I hope to go with this, it's what got me into this problem space in the first place. We have these things, teacher communities are our best strategy for just outcomes and equitable treatment of students. In some way, just about every reform effort has a teacher community attached to it. So it matters how we do it. Because we have evidence that if you don't, it's like you have pseudo communities where you're just pretending and you're just pretending to get along, and that's not helpful. That doesn't get us where we want to go. And so understanding those places, understanding these structures, these settings as robust settings for teacher learning. And something I'll be working on for a while. I'm not ready to state it yet, but I want to think about a teacher community as a potential social movement. I'm not arguing everyone is. I'm saying maybe. And so I've backed off on that to say as a lever for something. For something. And so within that community, what the JLS paper did, that I was really proud of, and I'll just say this, really, like to summarize this whole slide, it, to my knowledge, was one of the first examples of within group learning in a community of practice. Typically, all the studies had this group compared to this group, but this was within group learning in a community of practice. And I'll start wrapping this up because I'm observing the time here. I got called out on this on my reviews a number of times of where the apostrophe belongs. So I did actually mean for it to be there in that place. Because what I'm working on now, we're getting a paper, it's mostly drafted, it should be submitted pretty soon. I've had the good fortune of working with Fran Arbach, who's at Penn State. And she thinks about teacher community as an idea of like a study group. And so she tends to think about individual teacher learning. And so she had a curiosity. She goes, I wonder, could you use what you did in your previous study, could you do that with an individual teacher? Would that make any sense? And so that was really what it's like, we didn't know. I don't know if it makes any sense. And at first I thought, well, no, this cannot make sense because this theoretical construct is the community of practice. But then we challenged ourselves and we kept thinking about it a lot. And we said, well, wait a minute. If you could define the community of practice very clearly, the one that's most relevant, most proximal, and salient to the situation, you absolutely could use that. So that's what we're working on now. And I'll leave this here, but that will be written up and submitted within the month. And so we followed one of a particular teacher in her study. She had some NSF data. And again, in interest of time, I'll have to keep moving us through this. But what we're noticing is we're applying the same kind of framework and noticing the same kinds of things. Where we're almost testing out the framework too, just to see how it's working with a different kind of situation. It's like, oh, this is what she's noticing here. This is what she's noticing here, in terms of how she's framing it. What's changing? What's not changing? It's giving us productive insights into the teacher's learning. The next step of things, and we've presented on this at a conference, and we haven't had a chance to fully explore it yet. But again, it was my great fortune to take this class in social movement theory. I just happened to use framing tools, these diagnosis, prognosis, and motivational framing, the key constructs. There's many more ideas in collective action research. So one of the ideas that I thought was extremely powerful was this idea of frame alignment. So these practices of like frame bridging, frame implication, extension, transformation. So like linking two ideas that are ideologically congruent but structurally unconnected. An idea that came up before, when a new value is planted and nurtured. These ideas. So we have not fully explored these yet, but that's a thing that's coming up in future work of, again, additional ways and tools from the frame analysis literature that would be helpful for thinking about this work. So what I was hoping to convince you of in this presentation, I was hoping for us to, I started by having some kind of shared conversation and experience, because what I wanted to do, just a little bit, I wanted to disrupt where we were in our thinking about learning. And also, I didn't make any assumptions. I trust the scholars and thinkers in the room, every person here. I stand to learn a lot too. Maybe there's something I haven't thought of yet. It'll give me a chance to think about it. But I wanted this to start by disrupting this idea of learning and what it is and problematizing it just a bit. That made space for me to say, okay, I went through this. And when I went through it, I found that joining these two typically disparate literatures was productive. for telling a story of learning that preserved its messiness but also was productive. And what it afforded me was it did some really powerful work theoretically. It was something that I could follow through in the structure of a paper to organize and theorize the paper, but also gave a methodological way for evaluating data. Because the question, I mean, some of I'm thinking logically, I'm thinking about a pile of data, like what do you do with it? I mean, first of all, like seriously, what do you do with it? Like, what do you even put it? When you have data, like, do you put it on a computer? I mean, you know, do you put it on a drive somewhere? I mean, these are questions that you have. Like, what am I seriously supposed to do with this? And then it's like, well, now that I have it, and now that I've learned that you should name it carefully and store it, and not on cloud services, those kinds of things that aren't secure, and those kinds of things. Then it's like, well, no. Now what do I really do with it? And so, you can print it out and put it in binders and highlight and post it, and that's A-okay. You can use in Vivo or use Studio Code or whatever you happen to have. And those are different ways of looking at it. So for me, it gave me a filtering mechanism and a coding mechanism in addition to theoretical work. That's where I'm going to. Let's see, I had a conversation with grad students earlier about how papers are organized, and so if we had time, I was going to share a little bit more about that work. But thank you so much for your care. Thank you for jumping in with these conversations. I learned so much from you about that, and also getting your ideas and hearing my work from a different point of view. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much.